This is the cost of alternative energy. My name is Isaac Orr, and I'm a research fellow at the Heartland Institute, where I mostly read and write about hydraulic fracturing. So I get this question a lot. Why are we doing fracking? Why don't we just use wind and solar? And I always explain this to people in terms of their cell phone battery. So if your battery could be charged at any percentage, what would you want it to be charged to? And I do a lot of talks at colleges, and they're always like, oh, 100%, of course. It's the only smart answer. And I said, well, how much do you think of that battery would be charged if you used only solar and wind? And they're like, probably not much, probably like 20%. And you should see the jaws drop when I'm like, actually, solar is 0.4% of all the energy we use every day, and wind is 1.8. So your iPhone is an expensive paperweight at this point. So, but a lot of times, like that's enough to kind of get them open to thinking about alternative energy in another light. But the cost of alternative energy and how much it does cost is a whole nother ball of wax. So I'm excited for this panel. We're going to have Dr. Benjamin Zeiker, the always chipper Dr. Zeiker, will show us how woefully inefficient solar is in using the Ivanpah solar plant as a case study. Then we'll have James Taylor, who is a fellow Heartland Institute guy himself, and he'll be talking about why it's important to have low energy prices and why wind and solar actually drive energy prices up. And then we will have Mary Hutzler holding down the fort here at the end, the headliner for the evening. Mary is going to take us into the weeds and really get into the cost of renewable energy compared to fossil fuels, and I'm very excited for that. So just a few notes before we start the presentations. Please put your cell phones on vibrate or silent, so that way everybody's guilty. So that way we don't have any, what's new pussycat ringtones going off during the middle of the talks. Love the song, not so much during the middle of a presentation. So let's give a big round of applause for Dr. Zeiker and all of our other speakers as we begin this panel. So perfect, Dr. Zeiker, the floor is yours.
Okay. What's up, pussycat? You're kidding. My ringtone is the, believe it or not, the Soviet national anthem. Because I did a lot of work on the Soviet economy back when I was at RAND, and I became something of an amateur repository of communism jokes. But anyway, speaking of which, so I thought instead of going through all the numbers, I'd go through a few numbers here. I would talk a bit about the Ivanpah solar power monstrosity in the Ivanpah Valley of the California Mojave Desert, which really is quite illustrative of all the problems and fallacies inherent in the push for bigger market shares for unconventional electricity. So I'll talk about just a bit about the fragile, there are no more deserts, you see, there are now only fragile deserts. I've never understood what that adjective, fragile, really means, but read any newspaper article about anything involving a desert. They're never called deserts. They're called fragile deserts. And so anyway, we're talking here about the fragile Mojave Desert in the California Mojave. I will offer a few simple cost comparisons for Ivanpah. I'll talk about some net subsidy numbers after accounting for the fees paid to the federal government in comparison with the royalties that oil and gas companies pay for oil and gas production on federal land. I do want to talk about the environmental destruction engendered by Ivanpah. Never accept the argument from the proponents of these things that renewable power is, quote, clean, unquote. No, it isn't. Neither wind nor solar power are clean, and I will talk about that a bit. The actual performance of Ivanpah has a lot in common with Soviet agriculture, which I'll go through in a few minutes. And then I do want to talk about the basic technological problem that makes unconventional electricity uneconomic, and then conclude with a few lessons. This is a photograph of the Ivanpah solar power plant in the fragile Mojave Desert in California. lest you believe I took this off the website of some opponents of Ivanpah, you are quite wrong. I took this off the website of the Ivanpah solar plant owners itself. They're quite proud of this. They believe this is a thing of beauty. Now, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, I agree, but anyone not tied to the plant financially who thinks this is lovely really, I think, has to have a psychiatric examination, frankly. That is what the plant looks like, and there are actually 3 of those towers. I only got one in this photograph. Just some simple cost comparisons. Ivanpah, at its planned output, it has never achieved that plan, which I'll get to, about $180 per megawatt hour. These numbers come from various sources, the Energy Information Administration and Lazard and some other sources. Other utility scale solar, about 250. Ivanpah, at its planned output, is cheaper because of strong sunlight conditions in the Mojave Desert, as you might imagine. Coal is about $90. Gas combined cycle is quite cheap at $60. Nuclear power, I've argued, is simply not competitive with current and expected natural gas prices. Hydroelectric power, about $70. The Energy Information Administration claims that onshore wind power is as cheap as gas. That is so silly that that's a whole nother lecture. I'm writing a paper now on the evolution of the EIA estimates of the costs of wind and solar power since 2007. It's really quite striking. I wrote a book on the cost of on the economics of renewable power about 5 years ago. My estimate for the backup costs, the wind and solar power by their nature aren't very reliable. They have to be backed up with typically gas plants, sometimes coal, just to avoid blackouts. My estimate of the backup cost of renewables was $370 per megawatt hour, and I assure you that's a conservative estimate, but that's something I'm not going to talk much about today. With respect to the direct subsidies, Ivanpah got a $1.6 billion loan guarantee under the DOE Section 1705 program. That program, there's something called the credit subsidy cost, in which the recipients of guaranteed loans are supposed to pay the expected loss in case the loan goes belly up. But in fact, under 1705, the taxpayers pay that cost. And if you amortize that over the 25 years, that alone is worth about $12 million a year. There's the 30% investment tax credit, which Ivanpah gets instead of the production tax credit for solar power, which is $11 per megawatt hour. So since they're taking the investment tax credit instead of the production tax credit, they don't have to produce any power, literally, in order to get the investment tax credit. They get accelerated depreciation, assumed 5-year life for the plant. They get a 50% depreciation bonus in the first year. And this all ignores, guaranteed market shares under the renewable portfolio standards in California and other states, et cetera, et cetera. The subsidies for Ivanpah and for similar sorts of facilities are just enormous. If you look at the subsidies received by Ivanpah per million BTUs of electricity production or energy production in the case of oil and gas produced on federal land, Ivanpah is paying 88 cents to the federal government per million BTUs. They get $285 per million BTUs of production, or planned production, not actual production, because it's so much lower than their planned production is actually higher. But in terms of their planned production, they get $285. So the net fee they pay to the feds is minus $284 and a few cents. That's what they receive from the federal government. The oil and gas sector pays $1.23 per million BTUs of oil and gas production on federal land as a royalty. The EIA as the EIA defines the subsidies the oil and gas sector gets, that's 19 cents. In fact, EI is quite wrong about that. Those are not actually subsidies properly defined, but let's put that aside. So the oil and gas sector pays over $1 per million BTUs compared to the net subsidy received by Ivanpah of over $284. And again, I note that the EIA subsidies for oil and gas are not subsidies as an economist would define them rigorously. So in terms of the environmental effects of Ivanpah, first there's just the unsightly land use, a photo of which I showed you a couple of minutes ago. It sits on a little bit less than 3,500 acres of, again, fragile desert. A nuclear plant uses something under 100 acres typically for a 1,000 megawatt nuclear plant. A coal-fired 1,600 megawatt plant, 2 800 megawatt units, would consume, including the railroad tracks and the storage facilities and all the rest, about 800 acres. A gas-fired combined cycle 1,000 megawatt plant, about 50 acres. A 1,000 megawatt wind farm, somewhere between 48,000 and 64,000 acres of land, something on the order of 100 square miles. Have you driven through the Texas Panhandle at some point through Amarillo? You must have seen these enormous, wind farms. They just stretch forever. And this sort of land use disparity is unavoidable for reasons I'm going to discuss in a few minutes. In terms of wildlife destruction, the focal field, the mirrors are controlled by computers. They're called heliostats, and they focus the sunlight, reflected sunlight, into the tower. You remember the photograph I showed you? Well, the focal field is called the solar flux, and the temperature in the solar flux, the focal field of the mirrors, approaches 1,000 degrees. So insects are attracted to the glowing light, you would not be surprised to hear, of the towers, and where insects go, birds follow, and so many of them are burned, and people on the ground there call them streamers because they're really, party types. They enjoy watching these birds get burned. And the Fish and Wildlife Service sent some people out to look at this, and they, for several days or a week, whatever it was, and they basically observed one streamer every 2 minutes. And that seems to me the only dimension of renewable electricity that's actually reliable. But that's because I'm not a very nice person. In terms of the subsidy rationales for renewable power, and in Ivanpah in particular, Ivanpah created 2,600 construction jobs over 3 years, about 90 permanent jobs in terms of people who run the plant and deal with all the maintenance issues that arise. And this will result in a payment of about $650 million in wages over 3 years. You will note, and that is what the plant advertises as a benefit, a social benefit of the plant. This is the reason we should subsidize Ivanpah, is we're getting all this employment and wages paid. Notice that the environmental left poo-pooed very similar numbers in the case of Keystone XL, but they're quite happy to advertise them in the case of this monstrosity in the fragile desert. Notice that, I won't get into this today, but perhaps counterintuitively, jobs are not a benefit for the economy as a whole, they're a cost. They're great for the people who are hired, but any resource, suppose during President Obama's tenure, he said that some project would use a lot of high quality steel. That's great for the steel producers, but for the economy as a whole, the resources that are used in steel production can't be used elsewhere. That is the classic definition of a cost. Similarly, the labor resources used in Ivanpah can't be used elsewhere. It's great for the people who are hired, but the jobs for the economy as a whole are a cost. And in fact, because unlike Keystone XL, except for the problem of the use of eminent domain to acquire land for the use of a private project, that's the real problem with Keystone XL that very few people talk about. But except for that, at least Keystone XL is not subsidized, so the labor it uses is being used in its most productive use if you believe in market prices. Ivanpah is heavily subsidized, so the labor here is not being used in its most productive use. Then the argument is that, well, Ivanpah will generate all these tax revenues. You see $300 million over 30 years. It's not clear to me from all the propaganda that the plant's owners and supporters put out whether that $300 million includes income taxes. If it does, then there's an enormous double counting problem that I'm not going to waste time with today. But the larger point is that tax revenues are not a social benefit. They're a transfer. They take money out of some of society's pockets and put them in other of society's pockets. They're a transfer payment. They're not a social benefit. And even if they were a social benefit, they're not a gift. Ivanpah is going to consume public services, right? It's going to require police protection and fire protection and all the rest. They're going to impose costs on the public sector. I mean, that's why, just to pick an example, the people that argue that internet sales ought to be taxed because they're creating unfair competition with modern brick stores are quite wrong, except in the states where the internet operations are located. They don't require police and fire protection all the way. They're not imposing costs on the public sector, so it's perfectly appropriate not to tax them. Well, similarly, Ivanpah, it may generate a lot of revenue, but it's also going to generate a lot of demands for public services that are not free. And so the proponents, unsurprisingly, have not advertised those costs. And then my favorite, the whole greenhouse gas issue. Over 30, this is just quoting their website, over 30 years, 13.5 million tons of carbon emissions will have been avoided. I love that 0.5. Anyway, first, this is false because of the cycling problem. Because renewables, I think I just mentioned this, are so unreliable, they have to be backed up with conventional units, either mostly gas, sometimes coal, that have to be cycled up and down depending on whether or not the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. And because they have to be cycled up and down, they're operating efficiently. So once renewables reach a certain market share, the typical number is around 10%, you actually get more emissions thanks a lot. You actually get more emissions rather than fewer. I mean, there was an engineering study of Colorado that found that Colorado air, because of the increasing share of clean renewables, is actually dirtier than it otherwise would have been because of the cycling problem with the backup units. So anyway, 13.5 million tons of carbon emissions over 30 years. That's 450,000 tons per year. Global greenhouse gas emissions are about 38 billion tons every year. And so if you use, you don't even have to use any climate model, but if you use the EPA climate model, which I use, everybody who works in this area uses, the temperature effect of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 450,000 tons a year, in other words, about 1/1000th of 1%, is zero, regardless of what you believe about the underlying science. So Ivanpah promised 1 million megawatt hours per year. They're actually producing 650,000. The spokesman explained this by saying, quote, "The sun didn't shine as often as years of studies predicted," unquote. Which is not very different from Pravda every year for 7 years saying we had a lousy harvest because weather was bad. Now, that statement by the Ivanpah spokesman is not quite as stupid as it sounds. Think about, and there are two senses in which that is true. Think about sunlight at a given site. There's going to be an annual average. Some years it's going to be lower because there are more clouds. Some years it's going to be higher because there are fewer clouds. And so in other words, there's going to be a statistical distribution of sunlight conditions at any given site. And so what he might be saying is, look, for the first couple of years, we got unlucky. There were just more clouds than is usually the case, or is the case on average. Give it enough years, and we'll get the average that we promised you. That is one respectable argument. I don't think the spokesman is sufficiently sophisticated to understand that, but that might be one interpretation you put. Another interpretation is, and I think it's much more likely, is that these guys really don't know the average in any given year. And in fact, the whole statistical distribution might lie to the left of what they were claiming. In other words, the true average sunlight, which I think for Ivanpah is 500 to 550 watts per square meter, I'll get to that in a minute, is actually lower than they were claiming. And so in fact, on average, year after year, they're not going to get what they were promised. And that is a serious problem. And even because of this poor performance for the first 2 or 3 years, and because Ivanpah, has to repay these loans, we get the Ivanpah definition of chutzpah. In 2014, they literally asked the Treasury Department to give them a Section 1603 grant of $539 million so they could pay off a third of their original Section 1705 $1.6 billion loan that is already guaranteed by the Energy Department. You think there are no perpetual motion machines? You are quite wrong about that. All right. What's the basic problem here? At the Earth's surface, the energy content of sunlight is something like 150 to 400 watts per square meter. Well, Ivanpah is higher than that, given where it's located in the Ivanpah Valley of the Mojave Desert. It's probably 500 to 550, of which around 20 to 30% is convertible to electricity. They claim it's a little under 29%. Fine. So the problem with solar power is that, 1 minute? Well, you guys will just have to suffer. What people don't understand is that given the energy content of sunlight and wind flows for that matter, and given even the theoretical maximum efficiency of a solar panel, a square meter of solar receiving capacity is basically enough to power one 100 watt light bulb. That is what we're talking about. When people wave the solar flag, you should ask them what we're actually getting from this. And the reason is that the energy content of sunlight and wind flows is unconcentrated. Unlike fossil fuels, the energy content of which is quite concentrated. And that's why you have to have massive land use in the fragile desert of the Ivanpah Valley of the Mojave Desert. Ivanpah has 173,500 heliostats, each of which is about 15 square meters, and that's how they get their official capacity of 392 megawatts. Look, some truths are eternal. Government is the art of wealth redistribution, which means resource waste automatically. The environmental advantages of unconventional, clean energy are obvious if we ignore the environmental problems caused by unconventional energy. And this applies to wind and solar, all of them, wildlife destruction, heavy metal pollution, noise, flicker effects, and as I mentioned a moment ago, more rather than fewer emissions of both conventional effluents and greenhouse gases. For 4 decades, I testified before the Senate Finance Committee on some similar issues about last summer. And for 4 decades, the arguments offered in support of unconventional energy have been faulty, literally without exception. And you should simply not accept any of those. So thank you very much. Yeah, good, thank you.
Should I just jump on? All right. Well, thank you everybody for being here today. I recall 4 years ago, after the last general election, just the sense of doom, the sense of just depression when we thought we were going to have a federal government that was more conducive to free markets, it was more conducive to returning power to the people, and it didn't happen. And 4 years ago, many of the people I'm looking around and seeing faces here while sitting up on the stage, I recognize you because you were here 4 years ago. And 4 years ago, when so many people wanted us to put our tails between our legs and to go home and to believe that socialism had won, you guys and ladies were keeping the fire of freedom burning. And so when I see you here again today, I just want to thank you on behalf of myself, on behalf of the Heartland Institute, just for showing up and ensuring that we had a chance to now, where we have an administration that's more conducive to energy affordability, to personal freedoms. We have the infrastructure in place, we have the grassroots in place, and it's all due to you. So thank you so much for being here. In my talk, I'd like to talk about the varying costs of alternate fuels. And one of the first things that I'm asked, often in media interviews, is why would a conservative or free market think tank even indulge in the global warming issue? I mean, isn't this an issue of science? And if it is, then what does it have to do with politics? Well, yes and no. I mean, certainly it's an issue of science, and the issue of science should transcend politics. The problem is, what happens is we see the same leftist environmental activist groups that have always been looking to increase government control in the energy markets and that have always fought affordable energy. They're the ones who are presenting global warming as a means and an excuse to yet again seek to curtail energy freedom and affordable energy. So given that, it makes sense for us to look under the hood of the global warming claims. If indeed those claims are backed by strong evidence and it looks like we are creating a climate crisis, well then I guess if we have to, then maybe we would have to see higher energy prices and more government intervention in energy markets. However, if the science does not back up the notion of a global warming crisis, well then once again we're going to point out what this is, which is an excuse to enhance the role of government and fight affordable energy. So groups like the Heartland Institute, CEI, Cato, Heritage, many others, that's why we're involved in the discussion. We want to make sure that the science justifies the policy prescriptions. And from our perspective, from the perspective of the scientists we talk to, the answer is no, we are not creating a climate crisis. Therefore, I think it's very important that we focus on affordable energy, affordable and abundant energy. When people advocate more expensive power sources, be it wind power, solar power, what have you, it's not like we have an endless supply of money and it's we either spend money on quote-unquote clean energy or we don't. When we take money out of people's pockets in the role of higher energy costs, what it means is that money has to come from other things in life that make our lives happier, healthier, and longer lasting. In just a few photos to illustrate, money that is spent on higher energy costs comes away from money that could be spent on better housing, could be spent on better nutrition, could be spent on better education, could be spent on better health care, could be spent on consumer goods that make our lives more enjoyable, could be spent on time we have for leisure, money and time for leisure. All these things make our lives happier, healthier, and longer lasting. When we have higher energy costs, it's like higher taxes. We are taking money out of people's pocketbooks, putting it into something that we would otherwise be getting for a lower cost. So when we pay higher prices for energy, it's not just, well, you know, it's a good thing to have. Compare it with what we're giving up. Also at the micro level, in 2014 I published a series of papers for the Heartland Institute looking at renewable power mandates. And at that time, more than half the states, still is the case, more than half the states have renewable power mandates requiring a certain percentage of the state's electricity mix to come from expensive wind and solar power. Looking at it on a per household basis, what we found in the Energy Information Administration data is that in states like Kansas, the average household paid an extra $130 per year in energy costs as a result of renewable power mandates. Ohio, North Carolina, Colorado, New Mexico, these are all states where we publish papers specific to that state, and you can see the cost per household, $130 to $400 per year in higher energy costs. That's money coming out of our pocketbooks that we could be spending on things making our lives more enjoyable. Looking at the 50 states as a whole, what the data showed was that in states with renewable power mandates, electricity prices were rising 50% faster than was the case in states without renewable power mandates. That affects each and every household in those states and in the country as a whole. You can find these papers. Here's a screenshot of the Heartland Institute website. The bottom left, you see the headline for the paper on Ohio renewable mandates driving up electricity prices. I encourage you to go to the Heartland website, heartland.org, and you can find on the Policy Bot button, which is in your upper right. Let's see if I have this pointer working. There we go. You can do a search for Ohio renewable or renewable power mandates, and you'll find these studies. Now, not just at the individual level where we feel it in our own individual pocketbooks, but economy-wide, we can see the negative impacts of higher energy costs. Here I pulled data in blue. This is the price of oil per barrel. And this is taken from the Energy Information Administration. And in red, this is the unemployment rate. I multiplied it by 10 so it could fit neatly on the y-axis with oil prices. What we see is going back more than 40 years, we see a strong and direct correlation between energy prices and how our economy performs. We see in blue, when oil prices go up, we see soon thereafter the unemployment rate goes up. When oil prices come down, the same thing for the unemployment rate. Again, higher energy prices work as a large tax on the economy. Lower energy prices work work as a tax cut and a stimulus. This has been the case, very close correlation for more than 40 years, including you may see in 2007, 2008. Oftentimes people think that the Great Recession was caused by the housing bubble. The housing bubble was a symptom of, not the cause of, the Great Recession. You may recall in 2007 we heard a lot of drill baby drill. In 2007 unemployment was still low, but energy prices were rising rapidly. Oil was at $100 per barrel, gasoline nearly $4 per gallon. And soon thereafter, the same thing as we've been seeing for 40 years happened. Once the energy prices rose, once oil prices rose, unemployment followed soon thereafter. So we see the importance of lower energy costs. Now, in the past, coal and oil have dominated our energy mix. Why is this the case? Well, prior to 2006, the midterm elections, this was a wave election for Democrats. In the electricity markets, prices were primarily determined by cost. State public utilities commissions, what they were factoring in when they were determining whether to approve or reject proposals by the monopoly utilities to build new power, was what are the costs. The lower the cost, the better for consumers, the more likely a power plant was to be approved and built. In terms of transportation fuel, where you didn't have so much regulation, oil was dominant because it was the only feasible and affordable energy source. Now that's prior to 2006. The 2006 and 2008 wave elections for Democrats changed the equation. Unfortunately, Democrats were more predisposed to restricting energy, affordable energy, and putting more factors on unsubstantiated environmental claims. So what happened after 2006? The Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 put a de facto 10% ethanol mandate into our transportation fuels. This has increased transportation costs. Ethanol does not burn as efficiently as gasoline. Fortunately, it's only a 10% mandate. Hopefully we can get that repealed. We still have 90% of our transportation, give or take, coming from gasoline. Regarding electricity, by 2008, this is when a majority of states put into place their renewable power mandates. This is instituting more wind power, more solar power that are more expensive for us to afford. And we saw that in the data state by state that I published for the Heartland Institute. And at the federal level, the Obama administration implemented unprecedented environmental restrictions aimed primarily at coal power. Now, just to illustrate the costs involved when you mandate renewable power into our electricity mix, the Brookings Institution. This is a left-of-center think tank. I'm not quoting data from the Heartland Institute, from Heritage, from Cato, from CEI, or anybody else. This is the Brookings Institution. They cheerlead renewable power. Nevertheless, they published a paper in 2014. They compared the levelized cost of electricity sources. And what they did is they said, how much would it cost or save to replace coal with other energy sources? And the findings are striking, particularly regarding so-called renewable power. What Brookings found is that when you replace coal power with wind power, it raises electricity costs by 50%, quite substantial. Solar power is even worse. When you replace coal power with solar power, electricity prices triple. Again, this is coming from the Brookings Institution. Now, given the cost differences between coal and other power sources, it was a striking moment in January 2008 on the campaign trail when Barack Obama said that he was looking to bankrupt the coal industry. He said that under his plan to restrict carbon dioxide emissions, he envisioned a cap-and-trade system. He would make it impossible for anybody to build a new coal power plant. He said they could try, but it would bankrupt them. And he said the result would be that electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. And the reason they would necessarily skyrocket is because there has not been a cost-competitive electricity source with coal. If you take the most affordable electricity source out of the mix, of course electricity prices would skyrocket. Even Barack Obama admitted this on the campaign trail. But a funny thing happened. In the real world, certainly Obama's plans succeeded. He didn't get cap and trade, but through the Obama EPA, there were enough restrictions on coal power that coal's share of the electricity mix declined from 48% to 30%. Dramatic reduction. That's from 2008 through 2016. Yet when you look at the data from the Energy Information Administration, what we see is that in inflation-adjusted dollars, electricity prices actually declined. How could that be? Even Obama acknowledged up front electricity rates would skyrocket. The reason that happened is natural gas filled the gap that was given up in market share by coal. Obama was hoping that wind power and solar power would rise up and take coal's electricity market share. But the fracking revolution, beginning right about 2008, 2007, and 2009, it's called the fracking revolution. It's actually advances in fracking technology and directional drilling. And what these two advances did is they made natural gas much more available to be produced and at lower costs. So with the fracking revolution occurring just as the Obama administration was cracking down on coal power plants, natural gas prices declined dramatically. Most of the market share given up by coal, dropping from 48% to 30%, went to natural gas. And with natural gas prices so low, it has become less expensive to produce power from natural gas than coal. The Obama administration intended to have all of us in this room pay dramatically higher electricity prices, but what happened is natural gas saved his political hide, and it also saved us in our pocketbooks, our expendable income, and how we can have money to expend on things that bring us greater life enjoyment. Natural gas saved the day. Now, specifically, looking at how natural gas did this. By the way, the bottom number, I put this slide together a few months ago before the final 2016 data came out. Late in the season, late in the year, natural gas's share declined. It finished at 30% of our electricity mix in 2016. Still, it surpassed coal. But why is it that how is it that natural gas prices can drop so much as to reduce electricity prices? Keep in mind that when coal lost market share, we had to build new natural gas power plants, even though the coal power plants were functioning quite well. The reason is the price of natural gas is so inexpensive, and the cost of natural gas power plants are relatively inexpensive. A 500 megawatts natural gas power plant, combined cycle, costs about $500 million, and it services approximately 400,000 households. So what that breaks down to is about $1,250 per household when a new natural gas power plant is built. Now, if you also break that out over 50 years, which is a conservative estimate of the lifespan of a natural gas power plant, it amounts to $25 per household per year, or $2 per household per month. And when you're replacing a coal power plant, most of our coal power plants are 40 plus years old. So these are plants that are already on their downside that require significant upkeep, maintenance, upgrades, or replacement. So we can take that $2 per month and really make it about $1 a month because we're replacing power plants that require a lot of maintenance, upgrades, or replacement. $1 per month, if you look at the average household, it's less than 1% of our electricity bill. Now, even 1% is something we should be concerned about and see if it's necessary. However, with natural gas prices so low, right now in existing natural gas power plants, you can produce power at about 16% lower cost than coal. So you're paying 1% more in capital costs, but you're receiving power that's being produced at a lower cost. That is how, in real dollars, electricity prices declined even as coal lost market share. Natural gas has saved the day. We can see here, this is the Henry Hub spotcast for natural gas. Here's 2008 when Obama predicted that electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. Here's the fracking revolution, and what we've seen is consistently low natural gas prices in the years since. Now, switching over to transportation fuels, because we are talking about all energy sources, I don't want to go into too much detail because really gasoline, oil, they still rule the day, and it's for good reason. But the latest fad in transportation fuels from the environmental left was algae biofuels. Well, shouldn't we be growing this? We can power our cars from algae. This is so much better than gasoline. Well, first of all, it's tremendously expensive. But even overlooking that, the National Academy of Sciences, their National Research Council, published this white paper. I encourage you to look it up online. It's, I think, 50 to 100 pages. Sustainable Development of Algal Biofuels in the United States. And what they determined, even forgetting the economics, is that the environmental impacts of algae biofuels are devastating. Sure, if we fuel our vehicles on algae biofuels, we may not be getting some of the emissions of gasoline or ethanol. But in order to cultivate algae at such a large scale to produce the fuel that we would need to fuel our transportation fleet would take a tremendous drain on our water resources, on our land resources, would create a tremendous amount of toxicity, turning them into fuels. What they determined is that the environmental costs are extremely prohibitive, much worse than is the case from gasoline and from oil. So I encourage you to look that up when somebody challenges you about algae biofuels. Moving forward, looking at the electricity mix, we've talked a lot about the United States and our economics here. Globally, we have an opportunity to greatly enhance our economy off the natural gas revolution. So here, this is a screenshot. They have this real time on the Berkeley Earth website. And Berkeley Earth, by the way, they believe in a climate crisis, but they're working to produce the environmental left, or working to induce the environmental left to support nuclear power, natural gas, hydropower as more realistic alternatives to solar and wind power if you believe in a climate crisis. I hope most of us here do not, but from an from an economic standpoint, at least they're talking a little sense in terms of the other side. But here we have, this is a satellite image of the Earth in terms of real-time air pollution. And what we see is that, by the way, I took this screenshot at 6 p.m. Eastern time. I forget which day, but it was last week, March 13th. I took it at 6 p.m. for a reason. All day long, we had our industrial activity, our automobiles running, et cetera. This is a time of day that is least conducive to finding good air quality in the United States. And it's most conducive to finding good air quality in Europe and Asia when it's the middle of the night. So even with the disadvantage here in the Western Hemisphere, what we see is our air quality is remarkably clean compared to that of Europe and especially Asia. In Asia, where we see pictures of people walking around with the surgical breathing masks, where they had to worry about canceling the Olympic Games because of air quality, there is a tremendous demand for cleaner burning power. The problem is there is nothing there that can compete economically with coal. And people want to have an economy that's vibrant. They want to reach our living standards, and coal still dominates the day. However, if we were to, at the federal, state, and local level, policymakers are blocking liquefied natural gas export terminals. If we were to remove government obstacles to those export terminals, and were to ensure that we don't have any fracking restrictions that get in the way of natural gas production, we have a tremendous opportunity to take advantage of Asian markets. There is demand for cleaner burning energy. They're not going to pay triple the price of coal to do it, but with natural gas at prices competitive with coal, we have an opportunity to improve Asian environmental standards, but better yet, improve the US economy. Right now, China produces 4 times as much coal as we do. Most of the coal used in Asia comes from China and Australia. This is an opportunity economically for us to gain some market share. Ben talked about the environmental impacts of other sources, wind power, solar power in particular. So I'm going to go very quickly through this because he's already touched on it. But basically, when you hear the term renewable, renewable does not necessarily mean environmentally friendly. I mean, by definition, renewable means it's a resource that we can use again and again and again. So under that definition, hydro is just as renewable as wind and solar power. It's much more affordable and reliable. But even if we talk coal, natural gas, oil, you name it, we have centuries worth of these resources. The reason why people say we need renewables is so we don't run out anytime soon. We're not running out anytime soon of these other energy sources. So when people use the term renewable, what they're really trying to imply is greener, is more environmentally friendly. But renewable is not necessarily green. And Ben talked about this regarding solar power and wind power. Now, this is a wind farm in Spain. You see the birds that hopefully a few of them will make it through okay. Here in the United States, wind turbines kill 1.5 million birds and bats each and every year while producing very little electricity. At the Spark of Freedom Foundation website, we put out a paper this past summer. What we did is we took a full spectrum analysis of energy resources. It's not just emissions, but it's also land impacts, water impacts, species impacts. And what we found is that the best energy sources for the environment: solar power, hydropower, nuclear power, and natural gas. It's not just solar and it's not just wind. Wind power, by the way, was closer to coal in terms of its environmental impacts than it was to these other cleaner burning, better for the environment energy sources. When people talk green, don't buy the propaganda that it's only wind and solar. Finally, moving forward, what do we do? How do we make sure that energy remains affordable, abundant, and we have government policy that facilitates affordable energy? Let's let them all compete. The Brookings Institution showed that wind and solar, for all their claims about being cost competitive, are not there. When wind and solar advocates and industry people say we're cost competitive, fine. Then we'll give you access to the market, and everyone else should have access to the market too. When we give various energy sources access to the market, from the Brookings Institution, the bottom line here, net cost per kilowatt hour, what we see: wind power substantially more expensive than coal, solar power substantially more expensive, hydro about the same, a little less expensive, nuclear a little more expensive, combined cycle natural gas, quite a bit of cost savings. Let's remove government impediments, let the market work. Remember, we're in this, we got involved in this as public policy organizations, not because we're advocates for the coal industry, the natural gas industry, the nuclear industry, or the oil industry. We got involved because we're advocates of free markets and limited government. And therefore, when we hear about energy resources shifting from one source to the other, our electricity mix, we should cheerlead it so long as it's driven by markets. And as long as we do that, we have a bright future for energy here in the United States and around the world. Thank you very much.
My presentation today is on a study that the Institute for Energy Research commissioned to calculate the levelized cost of electricity from existing generation sources. And the reason why we wanted to look at that is that we wanted to compare those numbers with the cost of the levelized cost of new technologies. Now, the levelized cost is defined to be the net present value of the total cost of construction, including finance charges, operation and maintenance costs, over a specified period of time for a generating unit. And it's expressed in dollars per unit of output, such as dollars per megawatt hour. You'll see in the charts that we're using the notation LCOE for the levelized cost of electricity. Now, the levelized cost is a summary measure. It's used by the Energy Information Administration in their modeling work. It's used by other modelers as well as other analysts. And what we're trying to do here by using the term is to compare the cost of different sources of electricity generation, such as coal, natural gas, nuclear, wind, solar, and hydroelectric power, which we've done in this study. The Energy Information Administration just looks at the cost of new technologies. They don't look at the cost of existing technologies. And in their work, they look at the cost over a 5-year period, well, 5 years in the future. And they do that because they assume it takes 5 years to build a new nuclear plant. They also have a certain set of assumptions that they use. They show their numbers based on capacity factors that are at the higher level of the utilization range for the technology. And we call those the best case capacity factors. And they use forecasted prices for the cost of the fuel input to the generators. Now, levelized costs, as I said, include capital costs, fixed O&M costs, and variable O&M costs, including the fuel costs. They're levelized over a financial life that EIA uses, and EIA uses a 30-year time period, and that becomes important, as you'll see later. If production is higher, the levelized cost for technology is actually lower. And as a result, the levelized cost is very sensitive to the capacity factor. The base year for our study is 2015. If you take a look at electricity demand 10 years before 2015, you'll see that it increased very slowly at a rate of 0.3% per year. So we really didn't need to build all the capacity we've been building in the past because we had a lot of excess capacity at the time. But in fact, we've been building wind units, solar units, and natural gas combined cycle units. And that's because of federal and state policy. It's already been mentioned by other speakers that many states had renewable portfolio standards that mandated that a certain amount of electricity generation within the state came from renewable sources at specified time periods in the future. But there were also subsidies, for instance, the federal production tax credit for wind and the investment tax credit for solar, and regulations such as EPA's mercury and air toxic standard and their Clean Power Plan. Now, even though the Clean Power Plan isn't in force as yet, there are states and there are utilities that are planning for it. The chart that you see here is from the Annual Energy Outlook 2015. And the point of the figure is that EIA expected the mix of generating technologies to change. And in fact, they already have. Coal is now down to 30% of generation, and natural gas is up to 34%. So we commissioned the study, and 2 researchers did the analysis, Tom Stacy and George Taylor, and the study is published at the address that you see on that chart. Now, the methodology that we used was to use 2 databases that are available from the federal government. One is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC Form 1, and we got the most of the data that we needed from that survey. We got nameplate capacity, annual generation, capital expenses, operating expenses, and fuel expense. And that data is available online for 20 years. We used 1994 to 2013 data. But we had to cross-reference that data with an Energy Information Administration form, the EIA 860. Now, this chart shows the FERC Form 1, and it highlights the data that we took off of the form, and I've already mentioned to you what that data is. The next chart shows the cross-referencing that we did. Now, the reason for that is at one time, FERC had the Energy Information Administration clean the data, make sure that the numbers were in good situation. But in fact, the data now is not being cleaned, and we found a lot of data that was inconsistent or that was partially redacted. So we compared that to the EIA 860, and we're able to plug some of the holes, and then we found some of the other data on the internet. Where we couldn't plug the holes, the data were excluded from the analysis. So the components of the levelized cost were the construction cost with a repayment term of 30 years that EIA used, the ongoing capital expenditures, for construction that had not been paid off yet, any upgrades and environmental equipment, operations and maintenance costs, both fixed and variable, and the fuel costs that we used for both existing and new were the 2015 average delivered prices rather than the forecasted prices that EIA used. Also, EIA did have a component for transmission investment in their levelized cost calculation. But we added two additions to the analysis. One was we used actual capacity factors in 2015 rather than the best case scenario capacity factors that EIA used. The other was we added a term for the imposed costs. When you take non-dispatchable resources such as wind and solar, what happens is that you back out the dispatchable resources from the grid, and as a result they run fewer hours, but yet they still don't have a major reduction in their fixed costs. So these are imposed costs that we calculated. Also, when you have to ramp up those technologies quickly, you also incur an additional fuel costs, and that's part of the imposed cost calculation. So this chart shows the results of our analysis. The first column of data that you see is the levelized cost for existing technologies. For coal, we got $39 per megawatt hour. For nuclear, we got $29 per megawatt hour. The second column that you see in the chart are the levelized costs that come from the Annual Energy Outlook 2015. And as I said, these particular costs are based on the best case capacity factor for the technology and on the forecasted fuel prices, and they're for 5 years in the future. Then the third column is the levelized costs that we calculated, and they are based on the 2015 delivered price for the fuel, and they're based on the fleet average capacity factors in 2015. You can see for combined cycle natural gas, we got a lower levelized cost for new technology. It was $55 per megawatt hour compared to the 75 that EIA had. And the reason we got a lower cost was that the actual natural gas delivered fuel prices in 2015 were lower than EIA's forecasted prices in the future. Also, you can see we got a lower cost for nuclear, $90 per megawatt hour versus the 95 that EIA is using. And the reason there is that the capacity factor for nuclear in 2015 is actually higher than EIA's assumed best case capacity factor. Now, if you look at the bottom of the table, you'll see for the intermittent sources, we had no information on what existing wind and solar power would cost. And that's because there was not enough information in the FERC Form 1. Either it was redacted or there were just too few numbers in the sample to be used. And then if you take a look at our levelized cost compared to EIA, we had higher numbers for two reasons. One is the difference in the capacity factor, and the other is the difference in the fact that we added on imposed costs. You'll also see a footnote that says that these costs for wind and solar could actually be $25 to $50 higher per megawatt hour. And we get those numbers from looking at a previous study that Tom Tanton and George Taylor did looking at wind. And what they did was they changed EIA's 30-year assumption to 20 years for wind, and they found that that added an extra $11 per megawatt hour to the levelized cost. In the UK, they've done a study of 3,000 wind turbines, and they found that their operating lifetime is really only 12 to 15 years. And in their 15th year, they're operating at a far less utilization factor than in their first or second year. So that was a legitimate change that the Taylor and Tanton paper did. They also realized that wind units that have the best resources are located in remote areas. And as a result, there are additional transmission costs that need to be added in above what EIA assumed. So their estimate for those transmission costs were another $27 per megawatt hour. So for them, it was an extra $38 per megawatt hour, even above the imposed costs, which is in the $25 to $50 range. The next chart shows how the fleet average capacity factors affected the calculation. The first column are the average fleet capacity factors in 2015. The second column are the numbers that EIA used, the best case capacity factors, and the third column is the ratio. There are two technologies, nuclear and solar photovoltaics, that actually had higher capacity factors in 2015 than what EIA used. Well, what we did was we applied those capacity factor adjustments to the fixed costs of each of these technologies. The fixed costs come directly from EIA. They're in the first column of this chart. The adjustment factors in the second column, and then in the third column you see the adjusted fixed cost after we apply the adjustment multiplier. The fourth column is the variable cost, and here we backed out EIA's forecasted fuel price and used the 2015 delivered fuel price. The chart title says 2014, and that's a typo. And then you can see in the last column the numbers that we got for the levelized cost. The imposed cost number for wind, we estimated at $26 per megawatt hour, and for solar PV at $31 per megawatt hour. Now this chart shows the comparison between the levelized costs for existing units and those with the real-world capacity factors and the 2015 delivered fuel prices. And for instance, you can see combined cycle gas we found to be 61% higher than the existing units. For nuclear, we found them to be 210% higher. But what we really want you to look at is the existing cost for conventional coal and nuclear and compare that to the cost that we got for wind and solar. And the reason why we want you to do that comparison is because what we're doing is we're prematurely retiring some of these units. And as an example, you can see, or take Diablo Canyon in Northern California. PG&E has been pressured to retire 2 of their nuclear units, and they anticipate doing that in the next several years. And what they intend to replace them with is wind, solar, and efficiency improvements, or demand-side management. And they claim that they can do this without adding any cost. Well, we don't think that makes any sense. And in fact, we see the cost of retiring these coal and nuclear units prematurely to be 2.5 to 5 times higher when you replace them with renewable units. And in fact, they probably will end up building some new combined cycle gas units because of the backup power that they need. My next chart indicates that everything new is expensive, and if it ain't broke, you shouldn't replace it. And here we're comparing 2 vehicles. Some people like to replace their vehicles, but it's usually because they want a new toy or they prefer a different model. And in fact, personally, I have a 2012 BMW. Every month, the BMW dealer sends me an email telling me how much they want to trade in my car and how much they'll give me. But what they want to give me is only 1/3 of the cost I paid for it, so I refuse to just lose the other 2/3 of the initial cost for the vehicle, even though they have a buyer that they want for it. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't make the change. Okay. Okay. In the next chart, I wanted to talk about solar a little bit more and the issue with the imposed cost. In this chart, you can see solar production in the bottom curve, the red curve. And this is a day of September 3rd in California. And solar, of course, was producing in the middle of the day. The top line, the blue line, is demand at that time on September 3rd. And the yellow curve is the difference between the total demand and the solar production. So that's net demand, and you can see that in yellow. And the point here is that peak demand occurred around 8 p.m. in the evening, and by that time, there was no solar. So it wasn't contributing any capacity value to the grid. This curve is considered, or the net demand curve is considered a duck curve because the silhouette looks like a duck. Now, in the next chart, you can see the net demand, or the duck curve. And here, this is another day in California, March 31st. And here you can see that the addition of solar production in each year, and this is an estimate where they expect solar to increase each year, lowers the belly of the curve, but it actually does nothing to change peak demand. So it's supplying very little capacity value towards it. And as a result, that's giving us the imposed costs because we've backed out the conventional technologies for the solar. And not only have we backed those out, but now we need a ramp of 13,000 megawatts in 3 hours, which means more fuel. It's just like you were driving your car in stop-and-go traffic, and that uses more fuel. So this is going to use more fuel as you ramp up those technologies. I'm going to, based on time, go to the last chart, which essentially indicates the references to this study. We did 2 levelized cost studies, and one included wind, and the second one included wind and solar. And you can see where you can look at those studies from this chart. I've also included EIA's levelized cost study and our responses to both the American Wind Energy Association and the Solar Energy Industry Association's critique to our study. Thank you.
All right, everybody. Let's give one more round of applause for our speakers. I thought this was a great panel. All right, so we've got about 5 or 6 minutes for questions and answers because the next panel is actually going to be in that room. So contact Tim Benson about that. Remember, we're playing Jeopardy rules. You must ask a question, not make a statement. And I'm actually moderating the next panel, so I'm going to actually buzz out of here. But thank you all for your time.
My question is for Dr. Hutzler. Could you elaborate a bit on how you handled the backup and buffering of solar and wind? I didn't fully understand how you actually did that.
I did not go over those calculations in the presentation because they are pretty involved. If you take a look at the report, it itemizes exactly how to get there, and it does go through a couple examples, so I suggest you look at those.
Okay, I will. Thank you.
I'm not smart enough for Jeopardy, but I have never understood how people who call themselves intelligent, and you ask them, they will tell you, do not understand that we are on a planet that is rotating. Yet the entire solar, milieu is to compensate for a way to eliminate the rotation of the Earth. And let me give you use the radial stacker, telescopic radial stacker, and have it follow a parabolic curve. and actually collect the solar as it moves and utilize the rotation of the Earth to collect the energy. Another possibility is in order if solar or sulfur. Yeah, okay. Sulfur boils at 250 degrees and goes or boils. It melts at 250 and boils at 800 degrees. Why not use that curve? And I know this is anachronistic. And use steam engines to generate the power and end the cycle.
I'll just say from my perspective, not being up to speed on the specifics of those engineering challenges, I will say that when government gets out of the way and allows markets to work, when something becomes feasible and economical, then we may see movement in that direction. There are a lot of things that are really cool that we can do, but it doesn't mean necessarily it's economical to do so. But if what you're saying is true, then I would hope and expect that there will be people who realize they can make money off doing it and will research it and look into it.
Weissmuller. Jim, this is for you really. The ethanol lobby is quite powerful. It's a farm lobby. They are subsidizing ethanol. Is there a way to convert these subsidies so that they, instead of producing ethanol, can produce cornmeal, send it to India, send it to China, feed people, and get rid of the subsidies, and actually improve our gas mileage?
Yeah, Tom, you bring up a fantastic point. Not only the subsidy, well, I mean, the subsidies, of course, make it more economical to produce ethanol, but it's really the mandates of the 2007 law. And although it varies a little bit from year to year, we are devoting about 40% of our corn crop to fuel when we don't need to. And you bring up a great point about feeding the rest of the world. Boy, when people talk about global warming's impact on crops, although it's been beneficial and will likely continue to be so, if you're concerned about that, then maybe we should divert some corn to food rather than fuel. Good point.
I'm wondering, only because I think that you're looking at existing technologies, and obviously respond to the gentleman that those charts could change if our technology changes or our ability to, especially storage we haven't spoken about. One thing that has struck me in our discussion of alternative energy is I actually tend to embrace the thought that many who promote alternative energy at the lower scales, that we could move away potentially from a grid system. I mean, right now we all make our own heat at our own homes, generally speaking. And nobody thinks that that's a problem, that we need a utility to make heat and then send heat. They do that in New York City. But I think I'm wondering if you see any parts of alternative technology that you think beckon, that you think could change those, because when we're sitting in state policy discussions about this, at least I'd like to be able to point in Rhode Island. I have no choice but to try and point them in the right direction rather than lie in front of the bulldozer.
Any particular person you would like to answer that question, Brian?
I mean, obviously, you watch these technologies. I'm just wondering if you all have see anything that shows any promise, not even as alternative energy, but even say dispersed generation. That's not necessarily alternative if we do it with gas.
The argument for rooftop solar systems has been it enables people to, quote, leave the grid, unquote. They don't really leave the grid. They get subsidized to produce very expensive power, and they don't pay their share of reliability costs for when the sun isn't shining. So I'm really rather dubious, frankly, in an absence of some sort of technological breakthrough in the form of an efficient battery or radically more expensive fossil fuels, that you're ever going to see something like that. It's certainly possible conceptually, but I really rather doubt it.
Okay, this will be the last question over here because we got to move next door.
I live in the state of New York, which is ground zero for keep it in the ground philosophy. And there are people in my community that actually look forward to paying more for Priuses and for alternative energy because that's the penance for their philosophy. How do you answer those people, and you can't do it with rational thinking?
Well, sure you can. I'm always amused at the anti-fracking sentiments among the voters in Manhattan who consume cheap natural gas produced by fracking in Pennsylvania. It's quite an amusing dichotomy. If they want to impose costs on themselves, fine. They have every right to buy expensive whatever. What they propose is imposing large costs on others, and that's really rather much more dubious sort of imperative from, in my view, at a normative level.
And I would add, to the extent that when I produced the slide at the beginning of my presentation with the things that we can spend money on, including consumer goods and vacations, I don't want environmental activists telling me that I shouldn't be allowed to buy consumer goods or take vacations with my own money. So if they care to buy a Prius and spend more money than they need to on automobiles, that's fine by me.
All right. Well, that's it. Thanks a lot, everybody. Next panel is going to start in a couple minutes right next door. So just head on over. Thanks a lot.